Hello there guys, it's Joey, and this video is going to be the dark muse, the dark fae, creativity. And first and foremost, I'm not entirely sure why I currently look like Morticia. I have no idea why I'm so whited out on the camera right now. I've been playing around with it, trying to get it less so, and this is as non-crazy white as I can get. I mean, it kind of fits with the theme, so I guess we're going with it. So this is a requested video, and we're going to be talking about two fae energies in particular from the Celtic mythology. I'm going to butcher the names now. I thought I had written some pronunciations down. Apparently I did not. Okay, so there is the Amadan Doof, the Dark Fool. And the Rhiannon Sea. So we'll start with the Amadan Doof. I cannot pronounce these things correctly. I was sure I'd written it down. Apparently not. Apologies, I thought I had written the pronunciation down. So when the individual came to me and asked me if I would create items for these two, I said of course, and I began researching and looking into their energies and what they would mean in terms of creativity. And there was kind of like that dark muse, dark night of the soul in terms of creativity, the poet who loses their way, and depression, and that side of the creative journey, the creative process, the psyche. And it was a very interesting energy. It was also very interesting because when I announced and was showing some of the images, some people were immediately fearful for my safety, judging on the mythology, the folklore. And I thought it raised some interesting points with regards to what we were afraid of, that why we're afraid of these things, where the fear comes from, and perhaps what that is indicative of. And then going beyond that, looking into the folklore, going deeper. And it was the same sort of reaction that I had seen with goddesses such as the Morrigan in the beginning, when people were very much like, don't think you should be doing that. And it's a very strange reaction in people that certain types of energy are considered beyond safe, beyond what we're capable of. And to me, it was a really bizarre thing, because at no point did I feel that I was unsafe. I conduit for a living, and I connect with energies all the time. And for me, being respectful, honoring their energy, listening to the messages is just part and parcel of what it means to be working with spirits. And surely all witchcraft could be considered dangerous when working with spirits. All witchcraft could be considered dangerous. And like I keep saying, such a path is dangerous, but so are we. And taking the sanitization out of witchcraft is something that I've been talking about a lot recently, that it's not, I don't know, it's not a path that is without depth and perhaps risk, and it's very much like nature itself. It's reflective of the energies within nature, and nature doesn't have this moral conundrum. Nature doesn't play with kid gloves. Nature can be bountiful and life-giving and sustaining, but it can also be destructive and dealing in death in equal measure. And it's strange to me that there's still a good deal of fear with regards to certain energies, certain gods. And that doesn't mean going in there blasé, without respect, without doing your research, but that's not something that I would ever do. So it was interesting. It was an interesting moment of psychology as I was talking about these energies. So if you don't know, and we'll start with Madden do the Dark Fool or the Fairy Fool or the Black Fool is what he's referred to. Also called the Madden Breona, the Greatest Fool. He was usually avoided, especially on Midsummer's Eve, for he would sit on the hillsides of fairy mounds and play his reed pipes in a mad jingling tune, calling the unlucky to him. His face was considered terrible to see, his touch even more so, for it was the Geoth Sea, the fairy wind, which caused ailments in those it touched, most commonly a stroke that paralyzed the body. And there was this talk around the idea of madness. The insane were thought to have held a special place of reverence, treated almost as envoys from another place, as they could see things others couldn't. In Ireland, the touched that's what they were called, the people who were considered to be suffering from insanity and things, were touched by the High Jester and advisor to the Midnight Court, the Amadan Du or the Black Fool. And what was really interesting is that very, very quickly he presented poetry, and I wrote it down and I shared it, and that's I think when we then we got concerns, but we're going to read what I channeled. The path beyond the open eye, swollen tides, salt heavy and rich. Traveller, you are called home. Meet me at the tail end of nowhere. Between rhyme and reason, what nonsense is music repeatedly worn over leather bows and bells? The mind is rich with treasure or complicated lies. Thrilling is it not to find you do not know the beginning of demise. And it was a really interesting channel because everything had duplicity. Everything had more than one meaning. Everything was twisting and turning around depending on how you looked at the language and how you looked at things to mean. And it was really interesting to me that it was all about perception, and perception of these energies, of both of these fae energies from the Celtic mythos, were really bound to how people were approaching them, how people were afraid or not, the amount of respect given, and then kind of like the perception of what you see versus what you don't see. And it was really, really interesting trickster energy. I love trickster energy. It's some of my favorite. I think it teaches us more than any other energy possibly. I mean, I feel that trickster energy really does that because it challenges us to look at who we are in interpreting things outside of us and then inside of us, and it's not quite knowing where your footing is, and it's not being safe. It's traveling outside of the comfort zone. So we're going to look at the poetry a little bit closer, a little bit tiny. So the path beyond the open eye. And it's really, the very first line is really interesting to me. The path beyond the open eye. And you can see it as like the third eye and like the psychic stretching out into the world, because it's the path beyond what we can see with our naked eye. But that also kind of fed into that idea of the touched, as they were called in Ireland, seeing things that people couldn't normally see, having insight into the other world and the realm of fae, and being able to see the fae with their open eyes because their brain chemistry was different. Swollen tide, salt heavy and rich, traveller, you are called home. And at first it kind of has that oceanic vibe, but to be honest with you, it also kind of has like this crying vibe, because salt tears. So swollen tide, salt heavy and rich, and that's like the bounty within the mind coming out of the eyes, the bounty of the ocean. Both of these things being tied to emotional states within symbolism, particularly within poetry. Are being called home, a traveller, you are called home, was really interesting. What is home within this context? We've been called across the sea because this is fundamentally Irish energy. Or is it that like you've been called back to Ireland? Is it you've been called back to the grave even, because people who were said to have seen this energy or been touched by it could die from the interaction. And so there's that kind of salt energy, oceanic, otherworld into death energy here, which is really interesting. Meet me at the tail end of nowhere. And I was looking at tail end because I wrote tail as in tail end, as in, you know, the tail. And then I was looking at it, maybe I should have written T-A-L-E, end, with like the end of the story. Tricksters and with their riddles and the stories and the things that they put out there in order to kind of push humans beyond what is comfortable is kind of a well-known phenomenon. Like riddles and stories and things not being quite as they seem is a common occurrence in a lot of mythos to do with trickster energy. But meet me at the tail end of nowhere. It was really, it's perhaps the most interesting line to me in the whole thing. And the tail end of nowhere, that's again possibly a death reference, but it's really fascinating. Is it tail end of nowhere? Is that a sanity into insanity kind of vibe? It was really fascinating. Between rhyme and reason, which is a fairly well-known phrasing, when nonsense is music repeatedly worn. And this was so interesting because, again, when nonsense is music repeatedly worn, now is that worn like worn out, or worn like worn clothing, or worn over the head like a kind of like that madness, kind of that shroud, and then referencing his jingling music, which does drive people mad. Over leather bows and bells was interesting because the bows and the bells, it kind of has a music vibe. It kind of has like a drumming and a ringing and that kind of creating music out of thin air kind of vibe. And if you think about it, music is kind of nonsense. It kind of doesn't make sense when you're trying to like categorize it out here. It makes sense when you listen to it with the heart. And that was a really weird realization halfway through this. And I was like, oh, and then if you like mess around with certain sounds out of what the natural rhythms are considered, sometimes to our ears that can be jarring. And then sometimes when people do it really well, it then becomes a different kind of art form. And that's fascinating. And art form is kind of like the underlying crux. The creation process is the underlying crux of both these two Fey energies to me. The mind is rich with treasure or complicated lies. It's the kind of inferences are the same thing. That the mind pretty much tells lies all the time to survive. The truths that we tell ourselves aren't necessarily the truths of other people, and it's all very complicated. And the kind of delving into the mind vibe there with treasure, like the kind of like digging into the mind, it kind of has that madness vibe again. Thrilling is it not to find you do not know the beginning of demise. And that's an obvious reference to death energies at the end, I feel. The beginning of demise, like when do we begin to demise? Well, arguably from birth. And it's a really weird interplay and thrilling that you don't know when you're going to die. So live kind of vibe. It's fascinating. And I was looking at this trickster energy and I was thinking, this is incredibly interesting. As a trickster energy goes, it was very forthright. It came forward very, very quickly. And it kind of was like poking around at different energies within the dark creation Muse vibe that was the underpinning theme for these two dark Fey energies that twisted and wove into this. And I was kind of like seeing the common themes which would make people afraid. People are afraid of death. People are afraid of losing their sanity, of not being able to control things. And basically this dark fool energy who has a jester at the Midnight Court, he has the fool all over him, because the fool is often in court setups, historically speaking, he would play the fool, but he was actually very, very wise. And then he sometimes was the person that was able to impart wisdom to a monarch without losing his head, because it was presented in such a way that it was tomfoolery and could be ignored or written off if necessary. But when it was actually really pivotal, that the information could be then relayed, maybe that would take a seed in the monarch's head. So it was kind of like a really weird political dance between rhyme and reason. And I've just noticed that line. This is what I mean about trickster energies. You can go back over it and over it and over it, over it, discovering different ways. It's like one of those crystals when you're moving it around and seeing all the different colors and all the different facets. And it's very much like the human mind. You can see things from a million different perspectives and always come out with something interesting and unique. The idea of madness as well with regards to creativity is a really fascinating one to me. I looked into this with the kind of the battle rage last month or the month before. It must have been January. Pretty sure it was January, coming off the blood moon. Yeah. And that was kind of like that overarching idea of madness, that idea of being filled with the animalistic kind of madness. And this is a little bit more the stereotypical version of madness. And then the line between genius and madness is a thin line, and we like to hop on over back between them. And sometimes people who are truly geniuses in their own time are considered mad by the people around them because the people around them just don't understand them. There is some suggestion that people who are mad are actually having a kind of spiritual awakening beyond what normal human beings can see or comprehend, kind of like a shaman, sickness, kind of like an elevated state of being. And there are arguments back and forth about whether this is really not a good thing to be engaging in, to be calling people who require assistance and help recovering heightened spiritual beings, because it kind of elevates people who are struggling. There is that side of the argument, and then there's other people who are like, it's just because we don't understand and we can't control it. So there's an interesting dynamic there, and that's very much in the territory of the Black Fool, where there is no right answer. There is simply the conversation, there is simply the intricacies, there is simply opinion and no correct answers. And both these particular dark fae energies also had kind of like the memento mori vibe, and that is, remember that you too must die, so remember to live. And the Black Fool, he's, you know, said to be able to cause a stroke, he's be able to cause paralysis to the body, and even death. The Lianan's Sea from Celtic folklore is a beautiful woman of the Ossi who takes a human lover. The lovers are said to live brief though highly inspired lives. The name comes from the Gaelic words for sweetheart, lover, or concubine, and the term for a tumulus or burial mound. I made some more notes about this particular fae, as I thought this was interesting too. And her energy came about in some really... Liananshi, I did write it down. I've written here that it felt very much that there was a good deal of explaining away the human condition by blaming the fae for it. So she can be considered to be the personification of the suffering that a lot of poets, writers, creators have suffered and endured throughout the ages. There's kind of like the vampiric energy given to her, that she kind of drains the energy off the people who are creative, and that kind of feeds her, and that's why they don't live very long. I actually saw this in Grimm. the TV show, and I was like, "Oh, that's bad." And then that's the first interaction you've had with that energy is that kind of modern retelling of the story. But I enjoy modern retellings of the story and the mythos, so it's not all bad. Her image actually has survived, interestingly enough, in Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland by William Butler Yeats, and in La Belle Dame Sans Merci by John Keats from 1819. So it's interesting that the record of her has actually survived in poetry and in storytelling. I think that's very indicative of her energy. It's interesting to me, though, that the kind of self-destructive nature of a lot of artists is kind of being put into the archetype of this face. She's kind of being blamed for that energy, and maybe there's like this symbiosis between her and that energy. And if she has a kind of a dark, I hate the word, but the dark fae energy that kind of is intrigued by the human experience, the human beings going beyond what is usual, the creative process, the ones that truly shine a great creative light out into the world. And if that kind of draws her, but then they're naturally short-lived and they're naturally fleeting, and maybe that would draw an immortal creature to them because they are so short-lived. It's such a rarity, it's such a commodity in a way, that she nurtures that, knowing it's going to be short-lived to get the most out of it. And it's not necessarily that it's her having the destructive element, but she kind of gets blamed for it. And the very real result of artists being destructive and suicidal, destructive, they can self-harm, they can harm others, they can be violent, a lot of them have substance abuse problems, because they see the world in a completely unique way, or they feel very, very, very deeply and they can't connect to the world around them. And I feel the pain of it, because feeling very, very deeply in a world which values things quite frequently which are not felt so deeply is difficult. It's like living in a world where you don't feel you quite belong. And like the deeper the poetic energies, the creative energies within the self, the more potential for self-destruction there is. There is an interesting note here about the translation of her name. Actually, come on, camera, come back. This is what happens when you talk about Faye. Thank you. Giving indication of who she is. The words are Gaelic and refer to a fairy, Muse. Lianan means the love of my soul or spirit, and it literally meaning inspiration. C is the word for fae. In Irish poetic tradition, she was a muse who appeared to the bard as Aisling or vision. In his vision, he meets her on a hillside and she inspires music or poetry that has an otherworldly sadness and regret for the glorious past of the Irish. In this earthly realm so embraced with fear, her erotic sensual qualities are then demonized, which is a typical reaction to sensuality and sexuality. Particularly, you can see that with regards to when the Celtic gods became Christianized and they became demoted or demonized into fae. And if they were very sexual, this was then considered a bad thing, which gives the energy to, were these fae originally gods? Are they elements of other gods? And what we're actually looking at is the surviving mythos of gods who are lost and just written into fae legend, fairy legend. It's an interesting possibility. So you kind of have the sensuality, you have the lover aspect, and she's considered sweetheart, lover, or concubine, depending. And she also has that hillside death energy again. So again, the momentum mori energy comes into both of these fae, this dark, creative energy. She has more of a sensuality, sexuality. She's meant to be very, very beautiful, where interestingly, the dark fool is not. He's supposed to be horrendously ugly, terrifying to look at, which is something to do with perception again. It's interesting with the male-female dynamic here with the Fae, is that like the usual stereotyping, like the evil male is presented as ugly villain, whereas you can have a femme fatale evil female using her beauty to override good common sense of her lovers. Again, these are two unfortunate stereotypes within mythos, lore, folklore, modern storytelling, the whole 9 yards, about how the messages of darker energies, or whatever you want to call them, is often construed in order to breed fear rather than to get the message across. Interestingly enough, with her energy, she was far more elusive towards me than the Dark Fool was. The Dark Fool was very forthright, in so much as that he gave the information, but he wasn't forthright in the meaning of it, whereas her energy was really interestingly far more elusive, a little bit more on the shy kind of side, like the hidden kind of side. I don't know if shy is the right word. It's not that she was reluctant, it was kind of like you had to work for her energy a little bit more, whereas I think that the Dark Fool enjoyed playing with the perception, like, oh, you've come to, well, let's play with that energy, whereas hers is, if you want the boon, then you have to do the work, which, given that she, appeals to artists and things, makes sense. She, like, encourages the work of those who already are creating. So those are the two energies, and it was really interesting in terms of a dialogue around human psychology, because of this psychology of the artist, the dark side of artistry, of creation, of how separate and isolating it can make people feel, to see the world differently, to paint the world differently, to sing about the world differently, to feel very deep emotions that on the surface of it, other people aren't engaging within so easily, so much of the time, because it is draining. It takes a well of knowledge. It is emotionally exhausting. And obviously a lot of the creators kind of like burnt really, really brightly and then fell off the grid. And with the onset of things like Christianity, with the parallel with coming into the Celtic myths and demoting it to Fae, so the gods became Fae under the Christian mythology, there's also the strong introduction of particular Christian morality, for better or worse. And that had then stayed and stays in Ireland to this day, to some degree, more in certain places than others. But the strictness of that dogma and the rules and things is often against creation and creativity. It's kind of against the expression. It's definitely against sexuality, and any sexuality which isn't heterosexual, one-on-one. So anything outside of that, which is a whole host of a plethora, if you like, a rainbow of different sexualities outside of that. So, and if any of that was in the creative process of the individual, they might feel kind of restricted by the strictness of that overarching ideology, which is still present to this day, and depending on where you are in the world, is still present. So it's interesting about how the fear element came into this creation, that we were afraid to look at different aspects of the psyche and look at different questions of death, questions of creation, questions of sanity and what constitutes as sane or not. And for the path of spiritually ascending, the witch, the magician, however you want to express your particular denomination, there is going beyond what normal is, what people consider to be everyday. And to be honest, a lot of witches and magicians and so forth, they're called insane. They are mocked and ridiculed for believing in forces beyond the everyday. It's an interesting thought. And given how long we've already gone on, I'm going to stop there and show the items for the individual. So if you're not interested in the particulars, just the information, by all means. But there are some interesting sigils with these two, because I was asked for spell boxes. And interestingly enough, the pair of them have made their scrolls go awry. Oh, this is what you get for Fey energy. There is a pair of scrolls for both. Oh, they're over there. Okay. It's interesting. My little iPad makes a noise and then I see them. Okay. So first we have the Dark Fool spell box. And this is his sigil. Sigil work with me is, and you can see the box is painted gold on the inside, black on the outside, and then you've got very purposeful, as if the sanity is leaking. And I did this with both because I felt that the inside should bleed into the outside with the color paint, which is why that happened. So his colors were gold and red, and his sigil came through very, very strongly. There is kind of a feeling of perception. There's kind of almost an eye image in the middle, but not quite. You can see an eye there, but not quite. It's really, really interesting. And sigil magic for me is a big love. It comes very, very naturally. I know the individual who this is for had been doodling around similar sigils as well. So I thought that was really, truly interesting. And then I created, come on, I know we're in Fae country, but come on, please. Is that what it is? So the scrolls are basically their sigils and things sealed into a scroll. Come on, camera. Wow. Okay. Please. Thank you. And for him, we also have a pendant and a pillar. It was requested no glitter, or very little, minimal glitter. So you have the black fool, and you kind of have, it's like a burnt mud eye on a hill. It's very much about like kind of the glazing over the eyes and kind of challenging perception with his energy. And then I put his pendant on a black ribbon, and they're both on a black ribbon, and they've got unusual shaped spell jars for both. Hopefully you can see the energies within. And then for Leanne, she, her energies were so beautiful. They were much more delicate. They were much more of a lover energy. So interestingly enough, I originally painted a different box, a different color, and she wasn't having it at all, because initially I was going to have black and white. I was going to have hers were going to be white and his were going to be black. She wouldn't have it. She's a dark Fae. She wanted a black box. Same. She wanted the same gold on the inside with the same bleeding out of the creative energies, that same vibration that underpins both. And I was like, okay. So then this is her sigil. Her sigil is green and silver. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Hers is a lot more free-flowing. The Dark Fool's energy was very like front and center. It's kind of masculine, I guess, in a way, but because they're Fae, you kind of expect them to be a little bit twisty and things, but hers was a lot more labelled down. So there's that. And then her spell scroll. And then her beautiful pillar is really beautiful and really interesting because the color diffused through. The top has that kind of worldly green hills of Ireland kind of vibe, and almost moonlight as well, which I've heard her describe as moonlight on a dark night. I've seen that description of her as well. This is a dark green, but it does give a kind of a moon vibe when you look at it straight on. And her, again, I put them on a black ribbon. They don't have to stay on a black ribbon, but that's her spell jar. And hers has sealed with green wax and his with red. For the colour associations that I felt were, come on now, we're nearly there, thank you, we're nearly there. And then last but not least, Fae energy, guys. Fae energy, this is a brand new camera, is the smudge. Now the smudge is something which is slightly separate. The idea behind the smudge is of the dark muse, so it has that kind of creativity vibe to it. It's basically to induce the vision of creativity and the muse, that energy we talked about, where visions are given, peering past the normal, peering into the veil, peering into the otherness, to gain creativity, to gain insight, going beyond the usual limitations and restrictions, and playing on that line between madness and creativity a little bit. It's really gorgeous smelling, and I'm probably gonna put the smudge on store because it's evocative, it's mysterious, it provides visions, and it's absolutely beautiful. So that is the video for these two dark energies, quote unquote. I don't like the term dark energies, but these two kind of Fae energies, this creative depth, this interesting, intricate world beyond what we see with the naked eye. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you guys for joining me, and many blessings.